In a world where reality is controlled and history is rewritten, truth is the most dangerous thing a human can possess. Inside the glass walls of New Arcadia, humanity's final city, a discovery is about to change everything. Behind the perfect image of a society that survived the global collapse lies a dark secret buried deep in the archives. The catastrophe that killed 8 billion people was no accident. It was designed, planned, executed. Prepare to witness a perilous journey through the layers of a divided society, where the line between saviors and genocidal architects blurs beyond recognition. What is the price of truth when it threatens the existence of an entire civilization? And can a society built on lies survive when the truth is revealed? Experience Eden's Fall, a story of truth, power, and the cost of paradise. Eden's Fall, Chapter 1. The Glass City. The rain fell in sheets against the towering glass spires of New Arcadia, creating a symphony of droplets that echoed through the city's cavernous corridors. From the 157th floor of the central spire, Elias Thorne watched the storm rage against the reinforced windows of his apartment, the lightning illuminating the urban sprawl below in brief electric flashes. Weather control promised clear skies today, he muttered, more to himself than to the apartment's AI system that was surely listening. A notification chimed softly from his Neuralink implant, and Elias blinked twice to accept the incoming message that appeared in his field of vision. Citizen notice. Weather anomaly detected. All outdoor activity suspended. Return to designated housing units. Non-compliance will result in adjustment of social standing. He sighed, dismissing the message with a flick of his eyes. Another day, another weather anomaly. The frequency had increased over the past few months, but nobody in the upper levels seemed concerned. Why would they be? Up here in the clouds, weather was merely scenery. Elias ran a hand through his dark hair, catching sight of his reflection in the glass. At 34, he still had the physical appearance of someone in their mid-20s, thanks to the mandatory rejuvenation treatments. His eyes, however, betrayed his true age, or perhaps something deeper, a weariness that no treatment could erase. As Chief Archivist for the Eden Protocol, Elias had access to information few others in New Arcadia could claim. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, who safeguarded the city's historical records, had begun to question their veracity. His apartment chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal Cora, her rain-soaked lab coat clinging to her slender frame. Despite the disheveled appearance, her eyes were bright with excitement or fear. With Cora, it was often difficult to tell the difference. "You're not going to believe what I found," she said, not bothering with pleasantries as she rushed inside. The door sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss. Elias gestured toward the kitchen. "Dry yourself first. Would you like some tea?" "This isn't a social call, Eli." Despite her protest, Cora accepted the steaming cup he offered moments later. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a sip. "What's happened?" he asked, leading her to the minimalist living area where interactive screens lined the walls, most displaying archival data he'd been reviewing. Cora reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, translucent cube no larger than a die. It pulsed with a faint blue light, seemingly alive in her palm. "What am I looking at?" Elias asked, though something in his gut already knew this wasn't standard-issue Eden technology, a data cache. Cora lowered her voice, despite knowing that in New Arcadia, nowhere was truly private. "Pre-collapse. We found it buried in the exclusion zone during our expansion survey." Elias felt his blood run cold. "You brought unscanned material from the exclusion zone into the city? Into my home?" "It was already scanned," Cora replied, her expression hardening. "By me, off-grid. The official report shows nothing but contaminated soil samples. Do you realize what would happen if the architects found out?" "Of course I do." She thrust the cube toward him. "But you need to see this. It contradicts everything in your precious archives." Elias stared at the cube, professional curiosity warring with self-preservation. As Chief Archivist, he was bound by oath to preserve the truth of humanity's past, the catastrophic environmental collapse, the global conflicts over resources, and the visionary salvation offered by the Eden Protocol. The gleaming city-states that now house the remains of humanity were humanity's last and only hope, or so the official records claimed. "What's on it?" he finally asked. "Evidence," Cora's voice dropped to a whisper, "that the collapse was engineered." The exclusion zone stretched for miles beyond New Arcadia's protective dome, a wasteland of twisted metal and crumbling concrete, remnants of the old world reclaimed by mutated vegetation. Elias had only seen it in official documentation and sanitized educational materials. No citizen had reason to venture beyond the city's boundaries, and few had clearance to do so, except for Cora. As a senior environmental engineer tasked with assessing potential expansion areas, she was one of the few permitted to exit the dome and survey the Deadlands. It was a prestigious position, and one that gave her unusual freedom. Freedom she had apparently used to breach about a dozen high-level protocols. After Cora's departure, hurried and anxious once she'd transferred the cube's contents to Elias's secure personal server, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the encrypted folder now nestled among his legitimate archives. Opening it would constitute an act of treason against the architects, the ruling council that had guided humanity since the collapse. His Neuralink chimed again. "Wellness check. Elevated heart rate detected. Would you like to schedule a consultation with your assigned health monitor?" "Decline," Elias said aloud, then cursed himself for the physical reaction. He needed to remain calm if he was going to avoid triggering further automated wellness checks. Taking a deep breath, he opened the folder. The data was fragmented, corrupted in places, but still largely intact. Video files, text documents, and schematics filled his vision as he navigated through the digital archive. Most were dated from approximately 50 years before the collapse, the early stages of the Eden Protocol's development. A video file caught his attention. Initial presentation, Project Eden, internal. The footage was grainy, the audio occasionally distorted, but clear enough to make out. A woman in her 40s stood before a boardroom of executives, her posture confident as she gestured to projections behind her. "Gentlemen, the projections are clear," she began, her voice cool and precise. "Global resources cannot sustain current population levels beyond the next century. Competition for those resources will inevitably lead to conflict on an unprecedented scale." The camera panned across the boardroom, revealing men and women in expensive suits, their expressions a mixture of concern and calculation. "Project Eden offers an alternative to this outcome," the woman continued. "Controlled population reduction through engineered crises, followed by the salvation of selected genetic stock in our sustainable city-states. The resulting society will be stable, manageable, and above all, sustainable." Elias paused the video, his mouth dry. Engineered crises, selected genetic stock. The terminology was clinical, detached, as if discussing a business strategy rather than the potential deaths of billions. The rain continued to lash against his windows as he delved deeper into the files, each document revealing more of a conspiracy that spanned decades. The collapse, the series of environmental disasters and conflicts that had nearly extinguished humanity, had not been a natural progression of human excess and climate change, as the archives claimed. It had been carefully orchestrated, accelerated, and exploited by those who would later emerge as humanity's saviors. The Eden Protocol hadn't saved humanity from extinction. It had culled humanity to save itself. As dawn approached, Elias found himself staring at a list of names, the original architects of Project Eden. With growing horror, he recognized several of them as the ancestors of current Architect Council members. The rule of New Arcadia was a dynasty built on genocide. A final document caught his eye, a population manifest dated from the early days of New Arcadia's construction. He opened it, scanning the categories used to select the city's first inhabitants. Genetic viability, technical skills, psychological compliance, index, resource, consumption rating, social harmony score. Humanity's survivors hadn't been chosen at random or based solely on their contributions to society. They had been selected for obedience, utility, and genetic traits deemed desirable by the project's leaders. As the sun began to rise over the gleaming spires of New Arcadia, casting prisms of light across his apartment. Elias Thorne faced a truth that shattered his understanding of the world. His entire life, everyone's lives, had been built on a foundation of lies. The city wasn't humanity's salvation. It was a monument to the ultimate act of social engineering. And he, the Chief Archivist, was complicit in preserving that lie. "You look terrible," Maya observed as Elias entered the archive's central hub the following morning. "Another late night cataloging the glorious history of Eden?" There was always a hint of sarcasm in Maya's voice when she spoke about their work, but today it struck Elias differently. How much did his deputy archivist suspect? Had she seen through the sanitized history they curated just as he now had? "Something like that," he replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Any priority requests from upstairs today?" Maya handed him a digital tablet. The Education Division wants another revision of the collapse timeline for the upcoming Remembrance Day ceremonies. Apparently, the current version doesn't sufficiently emphasize the visionary foresight of the first architects. Elias accepted the tablet, scanning the revision request with newfound skepticism. Each year, the historical narrative seemed to grant more prescience and benevolence to the founders of New Arcadia. Now he understood why. "I'll handle it personally," he said, his voice neutral despite the turmoil beneath. "Are you sure? You usually hate the propaganda pieces." Maya studied him with concern. "Seriously, Eli, you look like you've seen a ghost." Perhaps he had, the ghosts of billions who had perished so that New Arcadia could rise, pristine and perfect, from the ashes of a manufactured apocalypse. "Just didn't sleep well," he assured her, retreating to his private office before she could press further. Once alone, Elias activated the privacy screens that transformed his glass walls into opaque barriers. It was an illusion of privacy. The architects could override such measures if they wished, but it gave him space to think. On his secure terminal, he began researching the names from the Project Eden document, careful to disguise his queries as routine archival work. Most returned standard biographical information, sanitized and glorified as expected. Some, however, had been almost entirely erased from the historical record, existing only as footnotes in technical documents or brief mentions in the earliest council minutes. One name in particular stood out. Dr. Lowell Chen, listed as Ethics Oversight for Project Eden. Unlike his colleagues, Chen's biography ended abruptly 2 years before the collapse, with no explanation for his departure from the project or his fate thereafter. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Elias glanced up to see Director Harlow's identification awaiting his acceptance. With a practiced motion, he cleared his research and accepted the call. The weathered face of his superior materialized on the screen, stern as always. "Archivist Thorne, I trust you're well." "Director," Elias nodded respectfully. "What can the archives do for the council today?" "This isn't an official request." Harlow glanced over his shoulder before continuing, his voice lowered. "There's been an incident in the Environmental Division. An unauthorized data object was removed from an exclusion zone survey site yesterday." Elias maintained his composure with effort. "I see, and this concerns the archives. How exactly?" "The tracking system lost the object somewhere in your residential tower." Harlow's eyes narrowed slightly. "Given your friendship with Engineer Santos, I thought you might have insights." So they knew about Cora's visit. The question was how much more they knew. "Engineer Santos and I occasionally meet for dinner," Elias said carefully. "But she didn't mention any survey findings last night, authorized or otherwise." Harlow studied him through the screen, his expression unreadable. "The object in question contains corrupted pre-collapse data, potentially dangerous misinformation. If you encounter anything of the sort, you're obligated to report it immediately." "Of course, Director. Information integrity is our primary mandate." After Harlow's image disappeared, Elias sat motionless, his mind racing. They were already searching for the data cube, which meant Cora was in danger. And if they traced the copied files to his personal server. His Neuralink chimed with an incoming message from Cora. "Need to meet. Usual place. 1 hour." Elias sent a one-word reply. Watched. Her response came seconds later. Always have been. Come anyway. The Central Gardens occupied the massive atrium at the heart of New Arcadia, a carefully engineered paradise of vegetation that served both as oxygen producer and psychological comfort for citizens accustomed to steel and glass. Unlike the rigid geometric design of the city itself, the gardens followed organic patterns, creating the illusion of wilderness within strictly controlled parameters. It was one of the few places in the city where surveillance was allegedly minimal, a concession to citizens' psychological need for perceived privacy. Elias knew better, of course. The seemingly random arrangement of exotic flowers and dense foliage concealed sophisticated monitoring systems. However, certain areas created natural interference patterns that made constant surveillance difficult, a fact that Cora had discovered years ago during her work on the garden's irrigation systems. He found her beside the artificial stream that wound through the eastern section, seated on a bench partially obscured by cascading purple blossoms. To casual observers, they would appear to be nothing more than colleagues taking a permitted recreation break. You shouldn't have contacted me so soon, Elias said quietly as he sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the flowing water. They're already looking for the data cube. It doesn't matter anymore. Cora's voice was strangely calm. They found the original survey team this morning. Official report says they were exposed to toxic residue in the exclusion zone. All dead. Elias felt his blood run cold. That's not possible. The protocols for contamination were followed perfectly, Cora interrupted. I checked their equipment logs remotely. No contamination was detected at any point. This wasn't an accident, Eli. The implications settled over him like a physical weight. How many? 4 researchers, all with families. Cora's composed facade cracked slightly. I sent them to that location. I was supposed to be with them. Why weren't you? Last-minute summons to review expansion plans with the council. Her bitter laugh held no humor. Seems the universe has a twisted sense of timing. Or someone had deliberately kept her away, Elias thought, but didn't say aloud. If what they discovered was true, if the architects had orchestrated the collapse itself, then silencing a few researchers would hardly trouble their conscience. I've been thinking about the data all night, he said softly. If it's authentic, it is. Then nothing we've been taught about our history is true. The collapse wasn't inevitable. Those who died weren't sacrificed for humanity's survival. They were eliminated by design. Cora's eyes met his, fierce with conviction. And that's exactly why this information needs to reach the public. You can't be serious. Elias instinctively lowered his voice further. The architects control every communication channel in New Arcadia. Even if we could somehow broadcast this information, the social stability protocols would activate immediately. They'd shut down the entire network before a single complete message got through. I'm not talking about a broadcast. Cora leaned closer, her voice barely audible over the stream's gentle burbling. I'm talking about the underclasses. Elias stiffened. The underclasses, the citizens who lived and worked in the lower levels of New Arcadia, maintaining the critical infrastructure that kept the city functioning, were largely separated from the professional and governing classes above. Their access to information was limited, their movements restricted to designated sectors. They were citizens, technically, but with significantly fewer privileges. They were also far more numerous than the upper levels acknowledged. The underclasses have their own communication networks, Cora continued. Unofficial channels that the architects know about but can't fully monitor without disrupting essential services. How do you know this? A thin smile crossed Cora's face. My father was from sub-level 42, hydroponic maintenance technician. I grew up down there until my aptitude tests qualified me for education placement in the upper levels. This was news to Elias. In their years of friendship, Cora had never mentioned her origins in the underclasses. Such backgrounds weren't technically shameful, but they weren't commonly advertised among the professional elite either. I still have connections, she added. People who can spread information quietly, incrementally, without triggering system alerts. Elias considered the risks. Distributing unauthorized, treasonous, Information through the underclasses would mean trusting people he'd never met with not only his career, but his life. If caught, the punishment would be severe. Not execution. New Arcadia prided itself on its humane justice system, but social recalibration, a process that few emerged from with their personalities intact. Yet the alternative was to remain complicit in a historical crime of unimaginable scale. Even if we managed to spread this information, he reasoned, what do you expect would happen? Revolution? The underclasses against the architects? They control the city's security forces, the resource distribution, everything. I don't know what will happen, Cora admitted. But I know what's right. These people, all of us, deserve to know the truth about how our perfect society came to be. What it cost. Who decided that cost was acceptable? Before Elias could respond, his Neuralink chimed with a priority alert. He blinked it into view and felt his stomach drop. Citizen notice. Mandatory security screening in progress at Central Gardens. Please remain in place and prepare for identity verification. He showed the message to Cora, whose expression hardened. That's not a coincidence, she whispered. They're tracking one of us. Elias scanned the gardens, noticing for the first time the security officers positioned at each exit, their black uniforms stark against the lush greenery. We need to separate. Now. Too late. Cora's eyes fixed on something over his shoulder. Don't look, but we have visitors approaching from the north path. Listen to me, Elias said urgently. If they take me in, I'll tell them I found the data cube outside my apartment and was reviewing it as part of my archival duties. You had nothing to do with it. Cora shook her head. They won't believe that. They might. I have the clearance level to handle restricted information. You don't. He grasped her hand briefly. Promise me you won't try to intervene if they take me. Before she could answer, a calm, authoritative voice spoke from behind them. Archivist Thorne, Engineer Santos, your presence is requested by Director Harlow. Elias turned to see two security officers in the black uniforms of internal stability, their expressions professionally neutral. No weapons were visible. They rarely were in the upper levels, but the implicit threat was clear. May I ask what this is regarding? Elias inquired, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Information security concerns, the lead officer replied. Please come with us now. As they were escorted from the gardens, Elias noticed other citizens watching with carefully concealed interest. Public security interventions were rare in the upper levels, where social harmony was a point of pride. By dinner, rumors would be circulating throughout the professional class about the Chief Archivist's mysterious detainment. They were led to a private transport vehicle, its windows tinted to prevent observation from outside. Once seated inside, Elias realized they weren't heading toward the administrative spire where Director Harlow's office was located. Instead, the vehicle descended, moving deeper into the city's core. Where are we going? Cora demanded, her composure finally showing cracks. The officers didn't respond, their attention fixed forward as the transport continued its descent. Level indicators flashed past, 100, 85, 70. They were heading to the transition zones, the layers of New Arcadia that separated the professional classes from the underclasses below. Few from the upper levels had reason to venture there, except for those whose work specifically involved infrastructure oversight. The vehicle finally came to a stop at level 33, far below Elias's clearance level. The door slid open to reveal not another security team, but a single figure. An elderly man in simple gray clothing, his eyes sharp behind antiquated spectacles. Thank you for bringing them, he said to the officers. You may return to your duties. To Elias's surprise, the officers nodded respectfully and departed, leaving them alone with the stranger. Archivist Thorne, Engineer Santos, the man said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Elias couldn't place. My name is Lowell Chen. I believe you've been looking for me. Dr. Lowell Chen's dwelling was unlike anything Elias had seen in New Arcadia. While the upper levels embraced minimalist design with interactive surfaces and embedded technology, Chen's home in the transition zone was filled with physical objects, books printed on actual paper, mechanical devices whose purposes Elias couldn't determine, and hand-drawn schematics covering entire walls. The architects prefer not to acknowledge my existence, Chen explained, as he prepared tea using a manual heating element rather than the standard automated systems. But they find my expertise occasionally useful, so they permit me this small space away from prying eyes. "You're the ethics overseer from Project Eden," Elias said, still processing the man's identity. "The archives say you died before the collapse." "A convenient fiction." Chen handed them each a steaming cup. "The truth is, I opposed the project's final directive and was removed from the council. My death was simpler to explain than my objections." Cora leaned forward. "You knew what they were planning? The engineered collapse?" "I helped design the early stages of Eden," Chen admitted, his expression heavy with regret. "A sustainable city, self-sufficient, recycling all waste. It was meant to be a model for transforming urban centers worldwide. Then the projections came in." "Resource depletion," Elias said, recalling the presentation from the data cube. Chen nodded. "The mathematics were undeniable. Earth could not sustain its population growth and consumption patterns. We faced a gradual decline over centuries, or a controlled reduction followed by stability." "Controlled reduction," Cora repeated with disgust. "You mean mass murder?" "That was the breaking point for me as well." Chen sipped his tea, his hands slightly trembling with age. "I argued for global implementation of resource restrictions, reduced birth rates, technological solutions. The majority disagreed. They believed humanity would never voluntarily accept the necessary sacrifices. Better to create a crisis, position themselves as saviors, and emerge with total control over the survivors." Elias struggled to reconcile the idealism of New Arcadia's founding mythology with this cold calculation. How did they do it? The environmental catastrophes, the resource wars, they affected the entire planet. "Calculated leverage points," Chen replied. "Exacerbation of existing climate shifts, strategic resource hoarding, biological agents designed to create panic rather than maximum casualties. The details are in the data you found, though I'm surprised any records survived the purge." "The purge?" "After the collapse, once the selected population was secured within the first city-states, all evidence of the project's true nature was systematically destroyed. History was rewritten. The skills of archivists like yourself repurposed to create a narrative of tragedy and salvation rather than conspiracy and culling." Elias felt a chill run through him. His entire career had been spent preserving what he believed was humanity's true history. Now he learned he had been curating an elaborate fiction. "Why are you telling us this?" Cora asked. "Why not expose the truth yourself?" A sad smile crossed Chen's weathered face. "I've tried, in small ways, preserving fragments of truth, placing them where they might eventually be found. But my access is limited, my movements monitored. I needed someone with both the clearance to confirm the evidence and the moral courage to act on it." He looked between them. "It seems I finally found both." "The security officers," Elias suddenly realized. "They brought us directly to you. Why would they do that?" "Not all who serve the system believe in it unquestioningly," Chen said. "There are more like us than you might think, waiting for the truth to emerge. The question is, what you intend to do with that truth." Cora exchanged a glance with Elias before responding. "We want to spread the information through the underclasses first, build awareness before confronting the architects." Chen considered this. A reasonable approach, though not without risk. The social stability systems are designed to identify and isolate dissent before it reaches critical mass. "We need your help," Elias admitted. "Your knowledge of the original project, your connections in these levels. We can't do this alone." "No one can," Chen agreed. "But perhaps together, with others who share our concerns." He set down his cup decisively. "Very well. I will help you reveal Eden's true origin, but you must understand the potential consequences. The architects will not relinquish control easily, and the truth may destabilize the very society we hope to reform." "What's the alternative?" Cora challenged. "Continue living in a paradise built on genocide?" Chen studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You're right, of course. Some truths must be told, regardless of the cost." He rose with surprising agility for his age. "Come, there are people you should meet, people who have been waiting many years for this moment." As they followed Chen deeper into the transition zone, Elias felt a strange mix of dread and determination. The gleaming perfection of New Arcadia, his home, his world, suddenly seemed like a beautiful facade concealing rot at its foundation. Whether that foundation could be repaired or would need to be demolished entirely remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the paradise of New Arcadia was built on lies, and those lies were about to be exposed. The deeper they ventured into the transition zone, the more New Arcadia transformed. The immaculate white corridors gave way to utilitarian passageways. The seamless design philosophy of the upper levels replaced by exposed infrastructure and practical efficiency. It wasn't decrepit. The city's systems were too well maintained for that, but it lacked the aesthetic perfection Elias had grown accustomed to. Chen led them through a labyrinth of service tunnels and maintenance halls, occasionally nodding to workers who regarded him with subtle deference. Finally, they arrived at what appeared to be an ordinary utility junction, unremarkable except for the faded numerical designation, T33107. "Watch your step," Chen advised as he pressed his palm against a seemingly random section of wall. A concealed panel slid open, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. "Unregistered spaces shouldn't exist," Cora whispered, clearly impressed despite her concern. "The city's structural mapping is supposed to be comprehensive." "The architects of any system," Chen replied with the ghost of a smile, "rarely account for the ingenuity of those who maintain it." The passageway opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber that had clearly been repurposed from some industrial function. Workstations lined the walls, each displaying data flows that Elias recognized as network traffic analysis. At the center stood a large circular table surrounded by about a dozen people of varying ages, all of whom looked up as the trio entered. "Friends," Chen announced, "I'd like you to meet Archivist Thorne and Engineer Santos. They've discovered independent confirmation of Eden's origins." A murmur ran through the assembled group. A woman stepped forward, her weathered face bearing the distinctive markings of long-term exposure to the harsher conditions of the lower levels. "I'm Vashti," she said, her voice carrying natural authority. "Chen tells me you have access to pre-collapse records that haven't been sanitized by the archives." "We do," Elias confirmed, still processing the revelation that an organized resistance existed within New Arcadia. Records that prove the collapse was engineered by Eden's founders. "We've known this for generations," said an older man near the back of the room. "Passed down in fragments, in whispers. But proof? That changes everything." Another voice, skeptical. "Assuming it's genuine." "It is," Cora insisted. "I found it myself in the exclusion zone, and the architects have already killed to keep it hidden." Vashti's expression hardened. "The survey team? We heard reports of an accident." Cora nodded grimly. 4 researchers, all dead because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Tell us what you found," Vashti requested, gesturing toward the central table. "Everything." For the next hour, Elias and Cora detailed their discoveries. The presentation outlining Project Eden's true purpose, the population selection criteria, the deliberate acceleration of environmental collapse. The group listened in tense silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions or pointing out connections to information they already possessed. "This confirms what we've long suspected," Vashti said when they had finished. "Eden wasn't humanity's savior. It was its executioner, and now it keeps the survivors docile with comfort and ignorance." "Not everyone is ignorant," Chen observed. "Your network spans multiple levels of the city." "Mostly in the underclasses," Vashti admitted. "The upper levels are more heavily monitored and frankly more invested in maintaining the status quo. Why question paradise?" "But they would question it," Elias argued, "if they knew the cost. Most citizens in the professional class would be horrified to learn their comfort was built on mass extinction." "Would they?" the skeptical voice challenged. "Or would they find ways to justify it? To tell themselves it was necessary, inevitable, a tragedy, but one that ultimately saved humanity? The uncomfortable silence that followed suggested the question had struck a nerve. Elias wanted to believe in the basic decency of his fellow citizens, but he couldn't dismiss the possibility that many would choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. "What's your plan?" Cora asked, breaking the silence. "Now that you have confirmation, what will you do with it?" Vashti exchanged glances with several others before responding. "We've been preparing for this moment for years. We have people positioned throughout the underclasses and even some in the mid-levels. With concrete evidence, we can finally move from whispers to action." "What kind of action?" Elias pressed. "Information dissemination first," Vashti said, "using the networks we've established. Then coordinated demonstrations across multiple levels. Nothing violent, but visible enough to force acknowledgement. The architects rely on the illusion of universal consent. When enough citizens openly question that illusion, change becomes possible." It sounded reasonable in theory, but Elias had studied enough history, even the sanitized version, to know that social transformations rarely proceeded according to plan. "The architects control the city's essential systems," he pointed out. "Water, power, air filtration. They could threaten to restrict these if faced with serious opposition." "Which is why we've spent years embedding our people in those exact systems," Vashti countered. "They can't shut down the city without our cooperation." The implications were both impressive and disturbing. This wasn't a hastily organized resistance. It was a patient, methodical preparation for eventually confronting the power structure of New Arcadia. "What do you need from us?" Cora asked. "Your technical expertise," Chen answered. "Access to information channels, and your courage." Vashti nodded in agreement. "You two represent something rare. Upper-level professionals willing to risk everything for the truth. There are others like you, but they're isolated, unsure who to trust. You can help us reach them." "And if we refuse?" Elias asked, not because he intended to, but because he needed to understand the dynamics at play. "Then you walk out of here with your memories of this meeting erased," said a quiet voice from the corner. A young woman with cybernetic enhancements visible at her temples stepped forward. "I specialize in targeted memory suppression. It's gentle but effective." "That won't be necessary," Cora said firmly. "We're committed to exposing the truth, whatever the cost." Elias nodded his agreement, though his thoughts had already raced ahead to the practical challenges. "We'll need to move quickly. The architects are already searching for the data cube and investigating Cora's survey team. It won't take them long to connect the dots." "Then let's not waste time," Vashti decided. "Chen, get them set up with secure communication protocols. Maya, prepare the distribution packages for levels 20 through 50. Eli, start compiling a vulnerability assessment for the upper-level information networks." As the group dispersed to their tasks, Elias found himself standing beside Cora, watching the efficient coordination of this underground resistance. "Did you ever imagine," she asked quietly, "that we'd become revolutionaries?" "Never," he admitted. "I always thought I was serving humanity by preserving its history. Now I find I've been perpetuating a lie." "Not anymore." She squeezed his hand briefly. "Now we're making history, not just archiving it." As Chen returned to guide them deeper into the Resistance's operations, Elias glanced at the data flowing across the monitoring stations. Somewhere above them, the glass spires of New Arcadia continued to gleam in perfect harmony, their occupants unaware that the foundations of their paradise were about to be challenged. The rain that had lashed against his windows that morning seemed prophetic now. A storm was coming to the perfect city, and nothing would ever be the same. If you enjoyed this first chapter of Eden's Fall, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support means everything as this dystopian tale unfolds. Stay tuned for Chapter 2, where we'll discover the first steps of Elias and Cora's dangerous mission to expose the truth about New Arcadia. What will happen when paradise begins to crumble? Subscribe now to find out.